seems that refugee women are underrepresented in the work market, and it's quite challenging to be a woman inside the camp.
Hi, welcome back to Women Inc. Talk. In today's episode, we're going to have Sarah from Jordan, and she's going to share her experience visiting a refugee camp in Jordan. So, for anyone who is interested, please stay tuned. Hi, Sarah.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. So today we're going to discuss about the refugee camp in Jordan and about your job regarding the woman refugee in the workplace that you currently do in Germany, right?
Yeah,
So could you please introduce yourself?
yeah. So, first of all, thank you for hosting me. Actually, my name is Sara. I come from Jordan. My background is actually in architecture. I'm an architect with further studies in urban planning. But by the time I was drafting my PhD research, I grew and I became more interested in a refugee camp that was opened in Jordan in 2012, and that started very quickly urbanizing. That was the door that introduced me to issues of refugees and migration and integration. And I did my research on the urbanization of the Zaatari refugee camp, which is why I'm now in this podcast to talk about it.
Oh,
And at the moment, I'm still working on the issue. And as you said, I'm focusing on the professional integration of refugee women.
so how is life in the Zatari camp and how many like days, weeks, months were for your stay when you were there?
So let's start from the beginning. Zaatari was opened in 2012, and it started as a tent exclusive space. So it only had tents. At the moment, it is hosting around 80,000 inhabitants, but there were times where it had more, maybe 200,000 inhabitants. This is significant on the scale of Jordan because it's a small country, so it renders it one of the biggest cities in the country. When you ask how is life, I would say after 8 years into its constructions, it's looking more and more like a city, like a built environment where people have their houses, their shops, their jobs, their schools, and a little bit of normalcy. And we can put this in quotation mark. I was there in the summer of 2016, and I was allowed 5 visits, each visit from 9 to 3. Again, it was very restricted, so I did not have an open door policy, but definitely informative visit.
Were you able to come say hi to the
I
refugees?
was in the Zaatari refugee camp, but I was given absolute freedom. I was allowed to navigate space, to talk to anyone I want. And I would say this has not always been the case. So, in the first days of, let's say, when Zaatari was created, it was more challenging for refugees and it was less safe. So, many times researchers had to stay in a specific tent on the border of the camp with the company of a police or security officer and had limited access to, let's say, refugees and their own, let's say, lived lives. I was very lucky regarding that. I could interview anyone and I could just randomly, I was focusing on the market street as I initially told you, and I could just enter random shops and talk at random with people.
Okay. So basically, this camp is concentrated for the Syrians, right?
Yeah, it opened in 2012 as a response to the Syrian crisis. It is located in the northern border of Jordan in close proximity, obviously, to the Syrian border and to a specific directorate there called Dara. And most of refugees come from this uh, directorate.
Okay. How is like the water access and then the education there, or like, yeah, jobs?
Yeah, so I would say water was one of the first regulated things. Initially, I would say by the creation of Zaatari, it was obviously more chaotic in the beginning and water had to be brought to them. But at the moment, it's regulated. All households and markets have their own access to water. And I would say that's essential, but not one of the most influential things that created the city-like settlement that exists now. I would say electricity was one of the most interesting resource that helped create the city, because it kind of helped change the quality of life people had inside the camp. For example, if you can imagine being a refugee who just arrived to the desert and lived in a tent, had no electricity, this meant that you had no mobile and no internet, no access to the world, no way to spend your time. And once people started connecting themselves to electricity, this had a major change to not only to their quality of life, but also to the possibilities. So you could let in any sort of electrically powered machine to the camp. This allowed the creation of all kinds of shops. For example, people can have refrigerators, can have bakeries, can have ovens, can have all these things, and it made a massive change. About healthcare and education, they're all kind of facilitated by the majorly the UNHCR, which is along with the Jordanian government managing the camp. And I would say, um, yeah, this has been created more like top bottom as opposed to the bottom up kind of spatial transformation that happened to the camp through refugees.
Yeah, I see. So, what about women's right in the camp? Is there any discrimination or sexual harassment issue in there?
Uh, there's no official discrimination, but there are huge cultural barriers, and it's quite challenging to be a woman inside the camp. However, it was more difficult than it is now. In the first days of the creation of Zaatari, we had huge problems that had to do with the underage marriage. So we in Jordan, we only acknowledge you're only allowed to get married if you're over 18. However, inside the camp, people were getting married underage, and this created a social problem of which marriages are recognized, and also it has a lot to do with what we think is related to human rights. Now, this practice had to do with the crisis, but it also had to do with their culture, and now there's regulation. So now, officially speaking, no underage marriage is allowed, and now there's only one way to get married in the camp, which is through a specific we call him imam, which is the Muslim priest who comes once a week and conducts these marriages. So I would say there are practices that came with the culture, or practices that were emphasized because of the crisis and the feeling of insecurity that had to be attended to. Other than that, I would say it's quite a conservative place. So your imagination of the lives led by women there has to fit within that context and that understanding. But I did interview few women who did own their own stores and had some sort of economic independence within the camp. So within this culture and this scope, we can discuss that it's getting better, but obviously it's not the most egalitarian place for women.
Mm, okay, I see. But for like the children,
Mhm.
is there like any protection, more protection, not only for the children, but women and children? Is there any like uh, extra protection for them, or it's normal for it's the same thing for anyone?
Well, it depends, because refuge usually happens in different phases, and your needs and situation change within time. So, as new arrivals, needs were assessed through a network of what was called street leaders. Each street leader was the connection between the refugees and the administration of the camp. So they would say, hey, we have a single mom here, or we have someone who needs this much diapers, this much blankets, this much items. At the moment, life in Zaatari is no longer in that emergency state, but now in the, let's say, building moment and construction moment. And I would say most probably their needs differ accordingly. And with that, the need to make the distinction that a woman has different needs at the moment, because nowadays they have access to all, for example, markets and resources that they would need, let's say, separately.
So, what about like the stigma and the hierarchical discrimination that occurs within the camp?
So, if we want to talk about the stigma of being a refugee, this is more present when we are in an out of camp setting. So, being a Syrian refugee within a Jordanian urban settlement, you do have the stigma. However, if you're in the camp, most all people are refugees, and all people, as I said, most people come from the same place, so they have the same background. This means that there's no they're actually the residents of the camp. There's no let's say social hierarchy that stems out of being a refugee or not being a refugee again within the camp.
Mhm.
However, the camp in its production and its urbanization carries out new identities and new hierarchies. They have before that there was a structure, as I said earlier, of street leaders who were the let's say connectors between the administration and the refugees, and those people had high social recognition, but they very quickly also abused their power, and they created a mafia like structure that eventually had to be dismantled.
People who actually abuse their power.
Mhm.
Is there any like certain type of regulation towards it, or since
Yeah, this system has been completely dismantled at the moment. There has been a strict Jordanian policy where they intervened in the camp and well, changed the power geometry. So there are no more street leaders. There are no more people who hold that kind of power. And there were people who were deported to other camps or even back to Syria who were associated with crime or with drugs or with whatever, let's say, illegal activities that existed. This significantly changed the life in the camp, and it became way safer. Earlier, we were talking about how much freedom I gained in the camp. It was hugely because of the dismantling of this power structure that happened before I actually accessed the camp.
so how many in total refugee camps in Jordan?
I actually don't know how many. It could be double digits. So within the 12 or 13, it's a country, as I said earlier, it's a country of with a massive history of refugees, starting with the Palestinians, the Iraqis, the Syrians. Again, the Iraqis came in two waves, the Palestinians in two waves, and the refugee camps vary. Some of them are very, very permanent and are very hard to distinguish from the urban fabric. They're like 60, 70 years old, and some of them are more recent, like Zaatari. Um, yeah, I don't have a number at the moment in mind, but there has been plenty.
Wow. Like, so basically, what's the reason behind the Jordanian to be as open as they are as a country to the refugee?
I don't know if there's a reason as much as a complete situational result of the context we live in. We are surrounded by countries who, one after another, entered different waves of conflicts and different intensities, and this created crises where people sought refuge in the first or immediate safe place. And just out of geography, this happened to be Jordan. We have direct borders with all these countries.
Okay. So it's like somehow it's not a choice, right? It's like it's
Yeah,
how
it's
it is.
yeah, it's the consequence of the current events.
Okay. The moment they're accommodating the scams to the refugees to the countries that need this, you actually raise a lot of issue within the country itself.
Well, definitely it's a challenge. It's a country with very little to no resources, and we depend on aid uh, massively, especially in hosting refugees. The kind of unrest it provides has to do also with the struggling strata of society. So sometimes aid is directed exclusively to Syrian refugees, even if we have also levels of people who live in poverty who have no dedicated aid to them. So these kind of conflicts do exist. And the stories, to some extent, are similar within different countries. I would say in Jordan, it is, to my knowledge, still balanced and still okay. In other countries in the region, it's more intense. For example, there's the example of Lebanon, where the situation was so threatening of the amount of Syrian refugees and the already the current population who's already suffering. And yeah, the discourse was higher, let's say, or louder.
What do you think about the perception or the idea that we need to be aware of the refugee? Because I believe somehow the media creates a stigma or this kind of image about the refugee. So, uh, so the moment you went to the camp yourself, like maybe you can like describe, like to give us a better perception about refugee, like the thing that we should know and aware of.
I think the most important conclusion of my work had to do with this question. It had to do with the way we perceive refugees. And I think we should start to perceive refugees beyond the language of crisis. There has been literature, recent literature, talking about that. But if we keep thinking of refugees as a deficit, as victims, are people without agency, we limit them within this structure, even though in reality they are people who regain agency, whose needs evolve, who are no longer living in the same crisis moments, and their situation is now changes it is now changing. And now when we want to create better response that accommodates these ever evolving needs, we have to move beyond this language of crisis, and we have to see them as more than mere victims, and again beyond the language of crisis.
So it really depends on how we perceive.
Mhm.
Okay, so is there any chance or way to people or me myself to help the refugee?
There are always chances for countries where there are refugees to be involved in your own community, to try to volunteer, to contribute to their efforts of integration. For example, in Germany, there's a lot of effort that can be done to integrate refugees. That's from a personal perspective. Of course, aid is always helpful and contributing to their, uh, let's say, so integration is not only economical, it's also social. It comes with the questions of language, of network, of having, let's say, social embeddedness. And there's a lot to contribute there on a personal and a group level.
So what about the significant thing or remarkable moment that has changed your mindset and perspective uh, when you visited the camp?
I would say for me, probably it's not one moment, it's a series of moments and realization. And the more time you spend inside the camp, the more chance you have to gain the trust of people. And then you actually start having acquaintances or people that you knew on a like deeper level. So it's still not, I did not have the chance to build friends in the sense, but to share some, to have some interactions with people in the camp. What was remarkable for me was a different aspect, I would say. It had to do with the comparison between Zaatari and the camps I visited in Germany. So in Germany, there are refugee camps. However, they're highly, highly temporary. There were structures to accommodate this massive wave of migration. And it was until people processed their paper, their courts appointments, and received the official decision for their stay in Germany, they needed to stay in camps. And those camps as structures were very chaotic. As opposed to Zaatari, when I visited it, it was 4 years old, already structured, self-organized. It was a massive comparison.
So what about your work experience within the organization that you're working in?
Yeah, so at the moment I'm working with a team called the Ausländerrat, which means literally the Foreigner Council here in Dresden. And my project works on the professional integration of refugee women. uh, it seems that refugee women are underrepresented in the work market, in the education market, in their German levels, in their even participation in the integration events that are organized by the state. This underrepresentation has to do with many factors. Part of it has to do with the amount of kids a woman has. So any woman with more than 3 kids is guaranteed to be delayed in her integration process. And it seems that refugee women are what is called in German dreifach benachteiligt. This means three folds underprivileged when compared to other refugee men, or as the category of refugees compared to other foreigners, or as foreigners compared to the Germans. So they have three levels of disadvantage that needs to be addressed. And in my job, I try to help with that.
Why are you interested in this kind of field? Like, since you actually explained that your background was an architect, right?
Yeah. So actually, it's similar to saying a little door opens another, and then I found myself in this field. I literally, my interest in the camp had to do with its urbanization, very urban planning and architectural question. However, when we talk about the lived space, we have to borrow concepts that have to do with sociology, social science, and social work. Now, during these years, when I was working on Zaatari, I also volunteered here in the city of Dresden, and I got to experience firsthand this kind of field of work. And it opened this door for me. And I have to say that was the transition. It was never a big decision or a big moment for me about changing career. It was a little door leading to another.
Okay, wow, nice one. So, like, what about working in this organization has changed? Like, how do you um, like motivate or encourage other women that they actually are i- important and have a big impact on the workplace, like somehow because you've mentioned that they're placed in the um, three list influential impact in the country. So
Hmm.
how do actually the organization encourage the woman?
Yeah, so the encouragement includes different steps. My work includes consultations where I have different visitors who usually they only have to be women. That's the only condition. They would come and we will see their profile, what kind of career step do they want to take. It does not necessarily have to do that I'm ready for a job. Sometimes I support in steps leading there, meaning how to get your certificates recognized, how to get little further education programs that enhance your profile, how to get an internship, and so on. On a second part of my job, I also organize different workshops and information events that have to do with professional questions and professional integration. So I sometimes host people to talk about what are the offers that exist here for refugee women? What are the professional needs? How can I enter the German work market? And so on. And on another hand, I train them on, for example, how do I write an application? How do I enhance my CV and so on. So it's a project that started only last year, and I think we need more years. But already, so this project is called Rescue Continued. Already, the proportion of women was enhanced significantly. Before my project, I think we had between 2 to 12% participation of women, and now my sub project, obviously being for women, has 100% women participation, which I would say is the step in the right direction.
Okay, I see. So what about the language barrier?
Mhm.
When they come to Germany, I believe they're not as fluent yeah, as the native speaker, or yeah. So do the organization provide the language education, language courses for them?
I would say they have this right from the state, not from the organization. However, the question of language is one of the biggest hurdles in the professional integration, not only of women, of all migrants, because you can learn the language in school, but it has to do with a lot of other integration questions that you actually master the language. You have to know people, you have to use the language, you have to communicate. So in order to feel secure with the language, you have to have access to other aspects. And this remains a challenge. Other than that, it seems that within different age groups, learning the language is a challenge after a certain level. So we have the A1 to C2, let's say, levels. And within different age groups, you can see that women struggle with the traditional teaching scenarios. And what we try in the Auslanderat, we have different other projects. For example, my project overlaps with a project called Cafe Halva, where women meet from different refugee backgrounds and they cook together and they talk. And basically, this alternative way of using the language is also helpful in order to, let's say, improve and, let's say, less officially, indirectly learn.
Okay. So, like, what do you feel like the most challenging thing that, for example, three things, the most challenging thing that the refugee faces in a daily basis?
On daily basis, I'm not so sure I'm equipped to say, but in their professional integration, I would say it has a lot to do with the mismatching qualifications between their home countries and for a country like Germany. So just to give you an example, a country like Germany is highly dependent on qualifications, and there are jobs that are traditionally practiced without qualification in the Middle East and or Afghanistan or Chechnya, where you can be a hairdresser by just getting to know the practice, going to a hairdresser, starting low and climbing up the experience. Here in Germany, you cannot do that without a certificate and some years of learning. Same thing goes if you want to cook or if you want to be a person responsible for cosmetics or so on and so forth. Of course, culture remains a barrier and prejudice and stereotype are associated with this. So, of course, there's challenges for a veiled woman to work as a hairdresser here. It's people are not accustomed to this, and people have a certain impression about what that means. Um, yeah, language is a common factor.
What do you learn from your findings?
I think what I learned was majorly, as I said, the description of refugees. As I said, beyond the victim, uh, let's say, limiting pigeonholing of refugees as victims. I also talked about the way a camp was urbanized and how it indicates a regained agency. So refugees do lose agency when they arrive to the camp. They also lose identity in the sense that when you come in a crisis, most people are considered as just not unnamed victims. It doesn't matter you, your personal history, your individuality. What matters is that you're a victim in crisis, you need aid. With time, people tend to reconstruct their lives. They tend to reconstruct identities. They become someone who has a certain job, who is doing X and Y. And they also reconstruct agencies. So I did a narrative approach when I went to the camp, and most of their narrative had a switching moment where they became people who are active and not helpless, who do things, who change their lives, who take things into their own hands. And that's quite informative. The second thing was the exceptionality that a setting like a camp has. And while I do realize that camps are not to be romanticized, they did pose some conditions that are hard to achieve outside the camp and facilitated certain aspects of integrating refugees. Regarding rules is one of the major kind of examples I can bring. Inside the camp, everyone was allowed to work, to open a shop and sell something. We had a rate when I was there around 60% of camp inhabitants had some sort of job. While outside of the camp, I think by the time I did my research, the ILO was having a statistic that around 6% of refugees had a work permit. Much more people worked without a permit, and they were put in a very vulnerable position where they were exploited and so on and so forth. And of course, the bureaucracy is much harder and needs time. Inside the camp, it was much faster. So this in camp out of camp discrepancy is quite interesting. There's an exceptional nature of the camp, and
Mhm.
it needs new conceptualization, I would say, and new perception.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for today. I'm
You're
so
welcome.
grateful for all your responses to the question and your time. Thank you very
Thank you.
much once again.
Yeah, I thank you also from my side, and I wish you all the luck with your podcast. It all sounds very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye.